IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Those of you who have been following our Friday episodes for a while will know that I'm a massive Deccan history nerd. Aditya and I have done all kinds of episodes about the Cholas and the Chalukyas, and we've even talked about, for example, the military revolutions of the 16th century and the conflict between Vijayanagara and the Deccan Sultanates. Today we're going to be talking about the Deccan, but from a very different kind of perspective, because we're going to be going back to a period that we've never really kind of explored in All Things Policy, and that is the Iron Age. Roughly around the 2nd or 3rd century BCE is a very interesting time in the Deccan, because you have a whole bunch of fascinating trends that are revealed to us by the archaeology in terms of culture, burial culture, in terms of the use of iron, for example, and of course the increasing preponderance of long distance trade. There's a general tendency for us to think about the rest of India outside of the Gangetic Plains, especially in the early centuries, as being some kind of backwater, right? You have all this evidence from North India about, great cities and wars happening, and then you have this spectacular Mauryan Empire that is supposed to have, ruled over the entire subcontinent. And in comparison to that, the Deccan and South India aren't really given a lot of attention, but there's a tendency almost to kind of assume that the Deccan was a passive recipient of influences from the Gangetic Plains. But a new generation of scholars is really pushing back against that. Those of you who listen to my Echoes of India podcast might have heard the season 3 finale, where I basically had a 1-hour discussion about what the structure of the Mauryan Empire might actually have been like, and that was substantially based on the research of Professor Namita Sugandhi, who is joining us here today on All Things Policy from Hartwick College. Thank you so much, Professor, for being here.
Thank you, Anirudh. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
It's my pleasure, and I have so many questions to ask you. I'm really excited about our discussion as well. But before we get into that, Professor, I'd just like to give our listeners like a broad sense of your PhD dissertation that I read. Professor Sugandhi's basic argument is that the Mauryan Empire is very often thought of in terms that isn't really supported by any hard material evidence. It makes a lot more sense to kind of see it as a network of different kind of nodes, which include, of course, the Mauryan state itself, in addition to merchants, monks, and so on, and kind of look at the way that the Mauryas influenced the rest of the subcontinent, not necessarily as this kind of quote-unquote anachronistic nationalist military dominance, but rather a much more unique and distinct kind of cultural phenomenon that all these local communities, especially in the southern Deccan, are engaging with on their own terms, rather than having it kind of forced down their throats by some distant Gangetic potentate. So Professor Sugandhi's research was based on the site of Tekkalakota in Karnataka, and she did a lot of archaeology there and kind of tried to examine really what was the footprint of the Mauryas in the southern Deccan. And you'll be kind of surprised because it's far, far less than you'd expect. But that, of course, is something that we're going to get into over the course of this podcast. So to begin with, Professor, I'd like to understand a little bit more about the Deccan. Right? There's a tendency to think of the Deccan, as I said, as this region that's kind of passively receiving influences from the rest of the subcontinent. But what does the archaeology really tell us? How do you see, based on your research, the Deccan in the late first millennium BCE?
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm glad you're asking me to contrast what the archaeology tells us, and really to contrast it to what the historical record suggests, which is pretty empty and doesn't really give us a lot of detail, which might suggest that the Deccan is sort of this cultural backwater. the early eras of human prehistory. But when you look at the archaeology, and even actually the physical anthropology, the studies of human evolution, we have evidence for human occupation that goes back, quite deep, thousands and thousands of years. So when we start talking about early human evolution and the actual peopling of South Asia, the Deccan becomes an important place. And I think one thing that's striking about this early and very long-term occupation that we have is, remember, much of this region is a semi-arid environment. So people are actually also very adept at surviving and sort of managing in these types of harsh environments. But we can talk about certainly the first and second millennium BCE, which is typically, I think, considered the Iron Age, as you said. But even prior to that, during the first half of the second millennium BC, we have the Neolithic Era, which is the time of the earliest farming communities and food-producing societies. And one thing that's special about the Southern Deccan area in particular is that people there were coming up with these ideas of farming and domestication independently. So this is actually a location where you have independent domestication happening of the local crops. And then over time, what you'll have is, contact with groups to the north, and then the adoption of other types of domesticates that are coming from the north. But I think what that points to is a very early sophistication and sort of dynamism in this area. And then we move into the Iron Age. And again, this area has very early evidence for iron production, which again points to their technological sophistication. And then you sort of mentioned the Iron Age as the 2nd and 3rd century BC. And that's sort of where we often end the Iron Age. And that it largely has to do with the appearance of these Mauryan inscriptions that are dated to the 3rd century BC. And then that sort of begins the early historic period. But in some ways, I'm glad that you mentioned that, the Iron Age continues on to the 2nd and 3rd century BC, because as you mentioned in my research to think about what the Mauryas are doing in this area, I didn't really find a lot of evidence for restructuring or any kind of large-scale change until many centuries later. So we can think about the Iron Age continuing on, sort of during this Mauryan period and even afterwards, if that makes sense. And then, again, when we think about the historical record, this Mauryan period or the 2nd, 3rd century BC is really when it enters our ideas about history. And actually, a few centuries later is when you start to get the local dynasty, Shatavahanas and so on, really start to pick up with historical studies and dynastic history. But that's sort of the broad overview. We don't have a lot of history for the earliest eras of the Deccan. But when we look at the archaeology, I think what we do have is evidence for tremendous complexity and innovation and technological sophistication.
This is so fascinating to think about because, as I said a little earlier, right, there's a tendency to think about people who are, for example, engaging in megalithic burial practices as somehow, quote unquote, primitive. But if you actually think about the logistical and technological feats required to just engineer these massive sheets of rock into place, then you begin to realize that these people are, as you said, they're very innovative, they're very creative. And I'm actually surprised that domestication had independently originated in the Deccan. When people talk about the domestication of various plants and animals, there's a tendency to think about the Great River Valley systems. You think about the Gangetic Plains, you think about the Indus Valley, and of course you think about Mesopotamia and all the other places. But you don't think about the semi-arid land, the Deccan Plateau, as having been the site of one of these kind of revolutionary changes, which must have had a very profound impact on the way that societies in the Deccan were actually being organized. And I think that is actually what the archaeological record shows us, but we'll come back to that in a little more detail later on this conversation. So one thing I want to kind of tease out a little further, Professor, is what he said about the Mauryas not actually significantly restructuring or changing things in the southern Deccan. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your research at Tekkalakota? How did you really go about it? Like, given the kind of historiography that's out there about the Mauryas and their, quote unquote, subcontinental empire, first Indian empire, as is very often called, the first Indian emperors, as Chandragupta, Maurya, and Ashoka are often claimed to be. What really does the archaeology tell us? Is there archaeological evidence of this kind of anachronistic national unity so early on in the historical?
That's a great question. And the truth is there is not a lot of evidence for Mauryan unity, I would say. But when it comes to the idea of shared traditions and shared cultures that develop over time, certainly we have evidence for connections that would have made these developments possible, I think, from very early periods. But how I came to this research, actually, I think I didn't actually begin with the archaeology. I began with looking at those inscriptions of the Mauryas initially, the Ashokan Edicts that have been sort of seen as the boundaries of the Mauryan Empire. And I think I had started by just doing a very literal translation of these edicts. And I think just looking at the literal reading of these things had made me realize how much political detail and grandeur we had translated and written into the edicts over time. So when we were, I think a lot of Mauryan history and a lot of ancient Indian history was initially written during the colonial era. And I think it was written to serve particular purposes, either colonial interests or later on national interests. And that's where this idea of unity, I think, why it was picked up so easily. But I think when I looked at the inscriptions themselves, I didn't see a lot of political content. And I began to realize how much had actually been sort of written into the edicts that wasn't really there. So then I took a step back and I looked at the different locations where we had the Ashokan Edicts. And I just looked at the site reports. And I realized I wasn't seeing anything about change during this particular, period of the early historic era. And then I also similarly began to realize that this transition in the South to the early historic period begins in the 3rd century BC. The Iron Age ends and the early historic begins. And that's actually just based on the actual appearance of the Ashokan inscriptions. There's nothing else to mark this change in the South. But this is actually 500 years after the early history begins in archaeological narratives in North India. And there, I think we're tracing it to the beginnings of the, Janapadas and all of that. And so again, I began to think about this sort of northern-centric bias when it comes to defining South Indian history. And when I started looking at the site reports, I didn't see any evidence that a lot of change is happening. And so that's what led me to sort of develop the idea for doing a systematic survey around 2 of these inscriptions at Nittur and Udagalom. And when we were setting up this project, we came to know that Tekkalakota, this site, is just 5 to 6 kilometers to the east of these 2 Ashokan inscriptions. And so we included that in our survey, our project area, because we had known this was a very famous Neolithic site. So in the 1960s, Dr. Nagaraja Rao, MS Nagaraja Rao, had discovered this site, and with the Deccan College, they had conducted excavations at the tops of the hills. And that site that they had excavated actually became what's known as a site type of the Southern Neolithic. So what we find there defines what we think of as the Southern Neolithic, these early farming communities that are developing domestication independently. And then in his site report, he had just mentioned, there's some Iron Age or early historic remains at the base of the hill. But because he wasn't interested in them, he didn't focus on them at all. He saw it as an intrusion. And I think this is, again, one of the problems when we study particular time periods. We ignore earlier or later ones, periods that might be represented there, because it's not what we're focusing on. So we had an idea that maybe this might have been the community where people were living during this time of Mauryan imperialism. But also we were interested in seeing what might be around those edict locations that were several kilometers away. And so when we started our survey, it quickly became apparent that the major occupation throughout all periods was at Tekkalakota. And closer to the edicts, what we found were megaliths, were Iron Age monuments that were part of the local traditions and the local cultures. And I think where we ended with our research at that time was really just remarking that the inscriptions were not placed where the habitation was, but it was placed in these locations of local significance or local commemorative or monumental sort of importance, by choosing areas with these megaliths. And it, again, sort of prompted us to focus much more on what was happening locally. And what we found at Tekkalakota was what we see at a lot of sites in the Southern Deccan is, not a lot of evidence for large-scale urbanism or state-level organization that we might associate with imperialism or the Mauryas, but rather we were seeing things like, this early evidence for domestication. Certainly we had this evidence for a what's called a Neolithic Ash Mound. So one of the cultural traditions of the Southern Deccan that we associate with the Neolithic period are these large heaps of cow dung, and some of them are so large that they really look like natural hills, and they've been burned at very high temperature, so they've become vitrified, and we call these Neolithic ash mounds. And we're still trying to understand the purpose, why people were building these things. But to me, what this indicates is not just the importance of cattle to this economy, but sort of their pyrotechnical abilities, the ability to achieve these very high temperatures. And that becomes important when we start talking about the next period, which is the Iron Age, which requires not just these high temperatures, but also the ability to control the atmosphere of your firing. So we start to get more sophisticated pottery, iron, all these things that are pointing to technological sophistication, but it stays small scale. We don't get urbanism. We don't get, dramatic sort of changes, just sort of these gradual sort of developments that indicate, sophistication in various things. We also see tremendous abilities of water management and water harvesting. So this is a semi-arid environment, and then during sort of the earliest periods, we have some climatic fluctuations, and certain sites in the Southern Deccan become abandoned. But one hypothesis, which we're still testing through our excavations, is that occupation did continue at Tekkalakota, and people were able to manage their water in such a way that they could endure in this landscape, despite any kind of fluctuations in the monsoon or in the climate. So over time, what we just have is lots of sophistication and innovation, but I have not yet seen much evidence for any kind of restructuring or large-scale change that we might associate with Mauryan imperialism. And things really do seem to continue in their sort of local patterns for much longer, until we maybe get to what we might call the early medieval period. And then we start to get a number of shrines and temples that point to certain changes, whether they're political or ritual. But I think what we'll be able to do with additional studies is trace the connections between all those developments and changes over time, which to me is very exciting because we can think about it from a local perspective and not in terms of these imperial models or colonial models of these external conquests or external flows of culture coming in and sort of influencing the communities here. We can think about what these communities were doing and coming up with on their own, which is very interesting.
Okay, wow. There's just so much to digest and dig into in whole conversation. So I'm just thinking about the way that the early historic in the Deccan is generally held to begin with the appearance of these Mauryan edicts, right? I read this really fascinating paper called "Towards a Political Ecology in Early South India" by Andrew Bauer, Peter Johansson, and Radhika Bauer. And they had this beautiful little timeline which kind of shows different things that were happening in the Deccan, starting from the Neolithic period, moving into the early historic period. And what was most striking to me about the timeline is that the way that the Mauryan edicts are kind of depicted on it, because it's just a blip, literally just a single dot, and there's much deeper and long-seated historical trends that are continuing well before the Maurya show up, and that continue well after the Mauryan Empire has collapsed. And these include things like, as you mentioned, Professor, agriculture, ironworking, and the domestication of animals. So it is really interesting to think about this as happening at such an immense scale. All these like local communities that are figuring out innovations and um, just going about their lives in a very different way from the way that North India is going about it, right? They don't see a need to urbanize, or for whatever reason urbanism is not really happening at this point of time. And it also, to me at least, it kind of challenges the way that we think about civilization more broadly, right? There's this kind of almost this inevitable kind of flow that is drawn from, okay, agriculture, animals are domesticated, agriculture is discovered, cities begin to form, kingdoms begin to form, and then empire forms, and then there's this endless kind of a rise and fall. That's the general narrative of the way that history is told. But the reality of things is far more complex, especially when you look at the Deccan, because you have agriculture, you have domestication of animals, you have very sophisticated technology. Like you said, you have pyrotechnics, you have the ability to control temperatures, to control atmospheres, and to harness water resources at a pretty sophisticated level. And yet none of that inevitably leads to urbanization. And actually seeing this as something that is done by local communities and trying to kind of understand the factors that led to them developing and engaging with the rest of the world in the way they did is just, to me at least, a much more intuitive way of trying to understand historical change and kind of shoehorning these ideas that history must always unfold in a single particular way. And and especially the fact that the chronological marker is held to be the appearance of the Mauryan edicts is something that I find so interesting, because why is it that in this enormous landmass that has all these distinctive features, something that happens in North India is suddenly held to be the marker for periodization? And it brings up like so many questions about historiography and the way that we think about history, and kind of challenges the way that we think about the history of the Deccan.
Absolutely. And I think you've given me so many questions to work with, and I suspect some editing will be necessary here because I may go on for a little bit. Just to start with that first question you had about the idea that the Mauryans are given such importance, and there's such a thing, particularly when we think about how our chronology in the South hinges on this supposed Mauryan conquest. And I think that really has to do with how we define the early historic period and hinge it on this idea of writing and the idea that the Ashokan Edicts are the first decipherable inscriptions that we have. But just to that point, and maybe this will sort of make us circle back to the original questions that you started off with, I think it's important to remember that we may not have the Brahmi script or this sort of nicely deciphered inscriptions in Peninsular India before the edicts, but we do have evidence for scripts. Now, certainly there's the Indus civilization script, which has not been deciphered yet. But also in Peninsular India, we have a script that is associated with the megalithic cultures. And they're just different characters, and it's more considered graffiti because we don't have these nice long inscriptions. But these characters come from contexts that date very early. We have one graffiti marked shirt with one of these characters that came from an excavation unit at Tekkalakota, and the radiocarbon dates from that layer were the 8th century BC. I think in Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu, they've also found similar, graffiti marked ceramic shards that have dated to these very early 6th century, 8th century. So there is some kind of a tradition of script, at least in Peninsular India. And I think it's connected to some of the flows of trade and other kinds of activity that you see connecting different parts of South Asia to one another. And they go back very early. And again, this speaks to what we have as evidence that we can consider, but then what maybe actually existed in the past that we just don't, have a lot of definitive evidence for yet. So I guess that's speaking to that question of why the Mauryas have this sort of significance in the South. Part of that hinges on the idea of writing. But getting back to the idea that why is this considered such an important thing? When you're bringing up, I think that the other research and talking about sort of developments in the Deccan, and this idea that we're not following this traditional model of growth and development, and what that typical model usually we describe it as. We call it unilineal cultural evolution or social evolution. And it's this idea that societies all develop and transform according to the same sort of pattern, and they all progress along the same way, perhaps at different rates. And this is an ideas about social evolution really develop around the same time that ideas of biological evolution are developing. And the assumption was you could apply those same laws of natural selection to social change. And it became a way of justifying European imperialism and colonization, because the assumption was that we have these different stages that we all have to that all societies pass through to arrive at some common end, and that common end was modern, industrialized, westernized society. So we started off as these small bands, these egalitarian groups, and a little bit of hierarchy and sort of, authority developed, and you became a tribe. And then we had a little bit more inherited wealth, and more hierarchy begins to develop, and you become a chiefdom. And then ultimately out of that, you develop into the state. And then from there, we get to the empire. So it's, again, this sort of sequence of increasingly larger and more complex and more unequal societies. And the assumption is that every society has to move through these different stages. And the logic of Europeans, when they were applying these concepts of social evolution to understanding, the world around them, was that not every society was as evolved or advanced. They were farther down that social evolutionary ladder, so they needed to be dragged up a little bit in order to arrive at that final stage of progress, right? That modern society. And these ideas of social evolution, I think we've largely rejected them, but many of these ideas are sort of built into our archaeological models, our historical understandings of change and development, and even in terms of the popular imagination, this idea that things obviously get bigger as they get more complex. It's, I think, something that we often unconsciously accept. Without really questioning it. And so when, as archaeologists, we describe what a civilization is, in the past, that was an older term, I think, we used to describe grand societies like ancient Egypt or Indus. And what we were really looking for was urbanism and the state. And I think our definition of civilization were societies that had urban centers and that were organized as a state, that sort of final stage of the social evolutionary ladder. And what archaeologists had done is they created a checklist of things that they could look for in order to determine whether their societies were states or were civilizations. And they had things like monuments and evidence for elites and sciences, but writing was part of that checklist. And what happened is, over time, archaeologists would take this checklist and they would try to apply it to the societies they were studying. If they didn't find everything from that checklist, they would say, oh, this is a smaller scale society. It's farther down that social evolutionary ladder. And I think that's where the Deccan often gets placed, not as a state until much later, because we don't have the evidence for writing or the elite class or, all these things that, from the early 20th century, archaeologists were telling us to look for on these checklists. And we now recognize, looking even at examples like the Indus, that not all these great civilizations are going to match this checklist. So, for example, we don't have monumentality in the Indus, but it's undoubtedly a civilization. But when we look at the Deccan, we don't have the kind of monumentality that archaeologists are expecting from ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia or the Indus, but we do have Neolithic ash mounds, and we have megalithic sort of monuments during the Iron Age. And then we have these traditions of script, and we have endogenous domestication and early iron production, but it's just not practiced on the scale that we judge to be, civilization. And I think it comes from this social evolutionary thinking that we've inherited from the Orientalist age, really, from the era of European imperialism.
How fascinating. I have a whole bunch of questions and reactions to this, Professor. But before I get into them, we're going to have to take a quick ad break.
Sure.
Today, with employees and IT teams no longer working under the same roof, fixing glitchy PCs and proactively managing the PC fleet is increasingly difficult. Intel vPro addresses these problems with two technologies. Intel Active Management Technology establishes a secure connection between Intel IT and Intel vPro-based PCs. In the event of a cyber attack, Intel Active Management Technology, or Intel AMT, lets IT repair and manage multiple systems simultaneously wherever they may be. The second technology is Intel Endpoint Management Assistant, or Intel EMA. EMA enables manageability via simple cloud-based web tools. Both these tools are part of the Intel vPro platform and allow faster response times, fewer help desk tickets, and lower support costs. Visit intel.in/ITheroes to know more. Remember, Intel vPro, it's built for business.
And we're back. So we've been talking about the nature of like the way that we think about archaeology, the way that we think about history, the way that we look for particular kinds of checklists when looking at archaeological evidence and try to fit them into that, rather than actually looking at the much more fascinating and diverse stories of the historical trajectories that archaeology can actually reveal. And Professor, you said something very, very perceptive, I think, in just before we went off to the break, and that was that there's a tendency to think that more complexity is always equal to bigger, and that really struck a chord with me because I happened to read about this fascinating site called Kodumanal in Tamil Nadu,
Mm.
which is basically, again, you have megalithic burials there, which as I mentioned, like people tend to think that these are like not very sophisticated because they are quote unquote stone age people making them. But these Neolithic burials include individuals who have been interred with Roman coins. They're wearing Roman coins as jewelry. They have very sophisticated iron weapons paired alongside them, and that really got me thinking because clearly here you have a society that is engaging in international trade, and yet its material culture and urbanism has not progressed to what we see from North India, for example. And I say progress, quote unquote. These are not massive urban centers. You don't necessarily, at least there isn't a lot of evidence of a state, as far as I know, that's controlling vast amounts of agrarian resources. And yet I very much doubt that if you were to speak to somebody from Kodumanal and ask them if they thought of themselves uh, as in any way less sophisticated than a contemporary resident of Pataliputra, I very much doubt that they would feel that way. These are people who live in a society that is quite sophisticated. Their ancestors have figured out all kinds of cutting edge technology that they've been utilizing for centuries and innovating upon for centuries. Just because they don't happen to fit into our preconceived notions of the way that a civilization should look doesn't mean that they are not sophisticated or that they are not quote unquote civilized. I also think that the comparison to the Indus Valley is again very useful in thinking about this, right? Because as our listeners may already know, there isn't a lot of evidence of of these massive, or really there isn't any evidence at all. Prasanna just cut out that last flub. There isn't really any evidence at all from the Harappan civilization of kings building massive tombs and pyramid equivalents. But as Professor Sugandhi said, these are obviously civilized people. There also isn't a whole lot of evidence of massive inequality the way that you see in Egypt or Mesopotamia. I mean, it is there, but not to the scale that you would expect. And this is definitely a very sophisticated, very diverse society. To me, at least, I mean, the clearest indication of that, or at least just because I've been getting into art history lately, is if you look at the sheer sophistication of their seals, it takes centuries of like design thinking to create seals the way the Harappans do. But that's just a little bit of a tangent. The same applies also to South India as well. If for the Harappans, at least, it's a little clearer because we can see, it's a big urban civilization, and we can see some ways in which it's different and kind of challenges the way we think of urban civilizations. But the Deccan, especially in the Iron Age, challenges our entire notion of whether urbanity is required for quote unquote civilization at all. And that just absolutely blows my mind, to think about the fact that something so distinct could exist. And because of, as Professor Sugandhi said, because of these very kind of, how do I put it? I'm struggling to find a word. These kind of monolithic and almost slow and dull ideas of nationhood that were bandied about by Europeans and then kind of uncritically adopted by Indians in the 20th century. It's really held us back from really understanding and engaging with the sheer, creativity and, I don't even know how to describe it. Just how surprising our history can be if we actually allow it to surprise us.
Absolutely, and I think these points that you're raising at least bring to mind at least two very important themes I think that we should consider, and then I think point to the value of thinking about cases like this that challenge these social evolutionary ideas about civilization or these classic understandings we have about complexity. And the first is, like you mentioned, Kodumanal, and we can think about certainly Tekkalakota and other societies across the Deccan. And this idea that they are in touch with these other societies, not just in South Asia, but with the classical world as well. It shows us that this idea of urbanism and large-scale complexity, we might call it, is not inevitable, and that people can be in contact with these societies and keep their own ways. And we often, I think, have this idea of complexity. It's almost like this solute diffusion model of the more, when you think about the diffusion of solubles in a liquid, the idea is that it always sort of, the more concentrated goes to the less concentrated until there's an equilibrium. But I don't think we should think about culture that way. I think we see this certainly with domestication as well. There are groups that practice their foraging strategies and live side by side with agriculturalists for millennia. And so just because you find a new way of doing things, or what we might categorize as a more complex way of doing things, doesn't necessarily mean you'll adopt it, doesn't mean that you're automatically going to pick it up. So I think that's one point to think about, that these sorts of ideas of growth and complexity aren't inevitable, the way that social evolution sometimes suggests to us. But then I think also we can think about is the value of these alternatives. So you sort of mentioned the sort of dry monolithic histories that we have from the earlier nationalist and earlier colonial eras. But I think when we start looking at these case studies and questioning these models that come to us through social evolution, we really do see the value of alternatives that don't tie complexity to scale or the idea of inequality. So, for example, you mentioned in the Indus, we certainly have evidence that there's going to be some social differentiation and hierarchy there. But we don't have evidence for the massive kinds of inequalities, class systems, and so on that we expect to see. And what I've seen over time is that we've really built this idea of social inequality into our idea of complexity as well. And the assumption is, as we become more complex as a society, we have more hierarchy, we have more systems of social inequality, and by extension, I guess, more injustice. But by saying that this is part of the process of becoming a complex civilization, what we're doing is naturalizing inequality. And we're sort of saying, well, this is just one of the consequences of being a complex society. And so when we look at the Indus, or we look at maybe the Deccan that challenge these sort of, models or these archetypical ideas of civilizations and states that we've developed in archaeology and history. And I think it gives us a new way of thinking about the present as well. So it's not really just about revising history or providing a more accurate account of history. I think it's sort of giving us a way to break out of the ways we have of thinking about the present day as well, that's similarly shaped by ideas of social evolution and these definitions of civilization and the state. But that might be rambling a little bit too much and getting away from the topic.
Not at all. This is actually what I find personally most fascinating about history, right? Is that such a profoundly revolutionary and creative idea that can transform our relationship not just to the past but also to the present can be sitting right there in front of us with all the evidence, just waiting to be assembled and pieced together. And that we live in a day and age where we're actually able to think this creatively and to think this innovatively. And to me, at least, it's such a revolutionary idea. It is so ingrained within us that the Mauryans ruled all over India, that the Harappans, were the most sophisticated of all Bronze Age civilizations, this peaceful, classless utopia, that the Deccan was this passive recipient of all these influences, that inequality is inevitable to any kind of urban culture, that any kind of state must always be oppressive, and that violence must be used to control an unruly populace. But history tells us that in reality, none of this is true. And the fact of the matter is that we have and have always had the ability to create societies that are good for all people within them. And it's so easy to want to believe in these staid histories that we've been taught, these kind of deterministic models of how history really operates, and to become just so cynical about historical change and humans' ability to affect this historical change. But increasingly, history is telling us that that's not the case at all. We can and have very, very rapidly created wonderful societies in the past, and there's no reason why we can't turn around and do that today.
Absolutely. And I think as historians and archaeologists, we have a responsibility to think about the implications of our research, because we should realize how these narratives about the past naturalize the present day and sort of shape the way we think and accept the present circumstances. But when we look to the past and we sort of are able to break beyond these models and these sorts of preconceived theories, I think, that shape the way we've read the record, we've read the evidence, I think it really gives us these alternatives that allow us to challenge things. Even the idea that cultural change and cultural influence is a unidirectional thing. When we think about Mauryan influence or influence across South Asia, it's always seen as flowing in one direction. And we never think of the circulation of ideas that archaeology shows us is going on through the circulation of material things. So in the way that we can think of ideas coming from the north to the south, I think it's time to really start thinking about ideas in the south and how they influence things in the north as well. It's not just a one direction of influence.
Okay, wow. This has really been one of the most thought-provoking episodes I've ever recorded on All Things Policy. There's just I really enjoy the sheer amount of like creative, academic-backed ideas that are being brought to this conversation here. So thank you so much for all this, Professor. And I really hope that all of our listeners have been enjoying this conversation as much as I have. But before we wrap up, I just want to ask you if you have any interesting examples from Tekkalakota that kind of are in line with all the different themes that we've been touching upon through this conversation.
Oh, absolutely, I do, Anirudh, and thank you so much for asking. I too have really enjoyed this conversation, and it's brought up a lot of ideas for me as well. But one example I was thinking of, a specific example at Tekkalakota, that again sort of speaks to these ideas of complexity and writing and scale, is this very interesting rock art that we found on the hills above one of these Iron Age early historic sites that we've been excavating at. And it's a very interesting image. We have a number of different images there that may date from different time periods, and we're still working on figuring out the chronology of these images. But there's this image of a person striking a bell-shaped sort of object, and that bell-shaped object actually turns out to be the hill itself that this image, that this rock art is on. And when he's hitting the hill, you see these lines coming out, radiating out from this bell-shaped object, this hill in the image. And what he's actually depicting is this tradition of musical stones that we find in South India. So, and it's associated with the Neolithic. And you have these areas where you can just hit and, ring on the stones, and it creates these musical sounds. And I think this has actually been incorporated into the pillars of some of the South Indian temples in later times.
Yes.
So to me, this is something very local and very interesting. So that itself, we have evidence for these musical stones at Tekkalakota and many other sites in the area. But what fascinates me about this rock art depicting this is these lines radiating out is basically the conversion of this something that you listen to into something that you see. So they're depicting the sound that comes from these rocks. And I don't have a date for this rock art, so it may be after, the official historic period begins. But to me, this is writing. This is the conversion of an auditory message into a visual message. So again, this idea, we can tie it to these early scripts that we're finding, the megalithic graffiti that dates to very early periods. There is this sophistication and this idea of these transformative technologies like writing and iron that are present in these Deccan communities, but we're not paying attention to it because it's not matching the scale that we typically expect or look for because of these models we're tied to. But I like that example very much because I think, again, it points to the sophistication of these societies in a very clear way that we're still trying to investigate, actually.
I'm just going to take a minute to kind of gather up the fragments of my blown mind from the floor of my study here. Because, wow, I mean, it is writing, exactly. And like, because we think about writing as being organized sets of symbols that are showing up in long strings, we might not think of it as such, but this is clearly an example of writing. This is clearly an example of very creative and very intelligent culture that is engaging with what it's seeing around it and expressing it in its own kind of visual vocabulary. Okay, wow, just fascinating, Professor. I hope that I'll be able to get you back on board with All Things Policy to have more discussions like this. This has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this very much. Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hello, everybody. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On a show about crypto, Rohan asked the question, what is the metaverse? To Harsh Rajat, creator of EPNS, that's the Ethereum Push Notification Service, and what the term means. There was a fun episode of Cyrus Says Cock and Bull that we did last week. We discussed a whole bunch of different things on it. As always, we discussed the India-New Zealand match and the reactions to it, and elephants in Africa being born tuskless. On Audio Gyan, Kedar introduces us to filmmaker Ashish Avikuntak and his artistic film, etc. On The Longest Constitution, Priya takes a look at Gandhi, same-sex love, and why a few of our laws need to be changed to accommodate the LGBTQIA community. And on The Wire Talk, Siddharth speaks to Ayaz Memon, the sports writer, journalist, lawyer, regular on Khel Niti, former host of one of our shows, The Cricketwala Chronicles, and so much more. They talk about his new book, Indian Innings, The Journey of Indian Cricket Since 1947. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Slate Coffee, Intel, Kotak Mahindra Bank, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.